again, in Maimonides, chapter 12, Laws of Neighbors, chapter 12. I'll share the screen in a minute. We're still discussing the details and the specifics of the law of the bar metzra, which is Aramaic for the neighbor. And a big idea here is that in certain cases, when a person sells a piece of land, the neighbor has the right to step in and buy the land off the purchaser. In other words, whatever the buyer paid the seller, the neighbor would then come in, reimburse the buyer, and get the land. And the idea is, again, predicated on a biblical commandment in Deuteronomy that says, you shall do that which is just and good. Yashar, that which is upright and good. And the sages of the Talmud apply this verse to this law of the neighbor. In other words, usually that there are many laws in the Torah where the Talmud says, well, if you want, you can go beyond the letter of the law. You don't have an obligation to do this, but if you want, you can. There's a distinction between the law and what is moral, which is sometimes the law does not obligate it, but you're encouraged to do it, but the court will not force you to. This is an exception to the rule where even though you have the right to buy, the court or the law would say that the neighbor has the right to take the field, reimburse you the money that you paid, as we have discussed at some length. Now, from here till the end of the chapter, we're up to really section 12, chapter 12, section 9, which we'll share in a moment, as I said. Now we're continuing to discuss the various exceptions to the rule, because it's not so simple to say, oh, it's always better and more just that the neighbor get it. Sometimes there are exceptions, and some of them are very interesting, actually. And sometimes some of the exceptions are quite sweeping. So let's see what's going on. The big idea is that some cases a person wants cash, a person needs cash right away. Some cases the Talmud realizes that if you're going to create this system where the neighbor has the right to buy the land, to get the land from the purchaser, what that would do is it slows down the efficiency of the market in the sense that it takes longer to sell, because people are more reluctant to buy until they figure out what the neighbors want to do, right? So there's a cost to pay. We mentioned the cost in the past, but there's various costs for this piece of law. But one cost is that for the seller, there's a burden on the seller where you can't sell as quick. Because again, if I have a potential buyer, the potential buyer says, why would I go to the bank and take the money? And there were no banks then, but why would I collect my cash and come to town and put in an offer? First, let me find out what the neighbors want to do, because the neighbors have the right to evict me, which again, that takes more time. The Talmud realizes that there are cases where speed is of importance. In other words, it's very important for the seller to be able to get money quickly. So what the Talmud is going to say is, in those cases, the law of the neighbor does not apply. Okay, so it's not just thinking about the neighbor. Sometimes we say, the neighbor says, well, if the seller is selling because he's desperate for cash, and we'll bring some of the examples, in that case, the buyer, I can go to a buyer and say, you can buy this land, and because I'm desperate, and whatever that criteria is, as we will discuss, therefore the neighbor can evict you, and that will encourage the buyer to buy. So all we're trying to say is, we don't have a blanket law. We have all kinds of exceptions, and this is one category of exceptions. But before that, we're going to have one more specific law, then we get to the broader category. So that is just by way of introduction, just to get us in the mood of what is happening here. So again, I'm on Maimonides, Laws of Neighbors, chapter 12, section number 9 is where we're up to right now. So the first scenario is a very interesting scenario. Let's say I want to borrow money from you. I want to borrow $100 or whatever, 1,000, a million, doesn't matter. And what happens is that you say, okay, you want security that I'm going to pay you back. So I say, you know what? You will get, if I fail to pay you back, my field will be mortgaged to you. I'll give you a mashkain. I'll give you a security. You have a lien on my field. And in that case, if this is your field, then if I can't pay you back, then you can get the field. By the way, this idea of making a mashkon, making security, is a very interesting idea because in some cases it's considered like if I don't pay you back, you already paid back. Let me give you an example. We studied in the past. When did we read about it? We read about it at A. Last week's Parsha, we read about that sabbatical year comes and the creditor has to give up his loan. In other words, if somebody owes me money, I have to forgive the loan. That does not apply if I loaned money to somebody, but they gave me an item for security. They gave me a mashkain. If they gave me a mashkain, if they gave me a piece of security, let's say they gave me their grandmother's diamond ring, for example. I'm the creditor. I have the ring. I was already paid back. In some sense, there's no loan. So the law says when the seventh year comes, I can't demand payment, but I don't have to demand payment because I already have been paid, right? So in other words, from the perspective of the law, if you have a piece of security, then the sabbatical year does not nullify the loan. What I'm trying to say here is that we really take this seriously. We take this seriously. If I borrow money and I tell you, here is an item that if I don't pay you back, it will belong to you, that has a lot of force. You're really connected to that item. If I could pay you back, I get my item back. But if I don't, I already paid you in some sense. Okay, so what's happening now? So I go to Vicky and I say, please, can I borrow $100? You say, well, I don't know. I need the money. I say, you know what? I'll give you a piece of security. Here's my field, or part of my field. Then comes 6 months from now, and for whatever reason, I want to pay you back, this, that, and the other. I say, you know what, Vicky, I'm going to sell you my land. The same land that I gave you for security, I can't pay you back, so I'm going to sell it to you. Let's make a bill of sale. I'll sell it to you. If that's the case, if I sell it to you, the neighbor can't come in and say, oh, no, I've been waiting for this field. I want this field. Why? Because you are my neighbor. The creditor is my neighbor, even though you live in a different state. But because there's a lien on this land, it's like you live here already. If you live here already, you're the neighbor. I could sell to this neighbor. I could sell to a different neighbor. So that's the first exception that we're going to read about today, even though there are many more. But that's the first one we read about today. So this is the beginning of number 9, when a person designates a property as security. In other words, I'm borrowing, the beginning of 9, I'm borrowing money from you. And I say, this land, if I can't pay you back, this land, you'll be able to collect your payment from this specific piece of land. It's called a mashkon. In biblical Hebrew, it's called a mashkon, which is security. And afterwards sells it to the person to whom he had designated it as security. So I borrowed from Vicky, and then I'm going to pay you back. In that case, the neighbors are not given the rights to displace the purchaser. The neighbors can't say, oh, you're a creditor, you don't really live here, you live out of state, you live out of the neighborhood. No. Why not? And the commentaries explain, because this creditor is considered to be the neighbor. And there's an interesting play in the Hebrew, in the Talmud, that the Talmud says that the word mashkon, I'm pointing at it here in the Hebrew, this is the verb, hamimashkein, someone who designates something as security. So it's hamimashkein becomes a verb, but the actual word is mashkon. Mashkon means the piece of security. So the Talmud says the elders of the city of Machasya, which is a city in Babylonia, explained. They told Rav Ashi, who was one of the people who wrote the Talmud, he said that the word mashkon has the letters of shachen. You see shin chaf nun, which means neighbor. So the same word for security really means the word for the neighbor. If I give you security, basically I'm saying you can move into this land, you can use it. So you are already a neighbor, and therefore when I sell to the creditor who held this piece as security, the neighbors can't evict him, the neighbors can't say you're a stranger. I am already a neighbor in this neighborhood by virtue of the fact that I have security on this field. Okay, that's one point. And now we're going to get another whole list of scenarios that all have a similar logic. All the scenarios are explained in number 9, and the scenarios are described in number 9, second half of 9, and the explanation Maimonides offers in number 10. So 9 and 10 are sort of they work together. We're going to have a bunch of examples in 9, second half of 9, and the solution and the explanation will be in 10. Again, scenarios where the law of the neighbor does not apply, and I could sell my land to a foreigner, to a stranger, and the neighbors can't do anything about it. What are those scenarios? So here, let's read. Again, if you have any questions or comments or jokes, you can come in. Don't worry about it. Jump in. Similarly, I'm going to try to point here, at least to the line. Similarly, the neighbors are not given the right to displace the purchaser when a person sells a property because it is located far from him in order to purchase another that is located closer. That's one example. When the seller sold the less valuable property in order to use the proceeds of the sale to purchase a more valuable one. Okay, these are two scenarios. So I'm the seller. I have a piece of real estate. The problem with that piece of real estate is that the piece of real estate is distant, and I want to buy one closer to my house. Okay? Or I have a piece of real estate that's not so great. I want to sell it, and I want to buy one that's better. Okay? So now this is considered a sale where time is of essence. And if time is of essence, we want to help the seller. And because we want to help the seller, in other words, usually we say we want to look at the good for the neighbor. But in this case, the good for the seller takes precedence. And therefore, we say the neighbor cannot evict the purchaser, which will encourage the purchaser to step forward, which would make this process come quicker, as Maimonides will explain in number 10. Now we continue, more examples. When he sold a property to pay his taxes to the king, okay? So it's not like it's like the IRS. They're knocking on your door, they need payment. If you don't pay right now, they'll put you in prison. What am I gonna say? I have to sell my land, but then if I sell it to my land and then the neighbor is gonna step in, it's going to discourage the purchaser. It's going to make it slow down the process. By then, the king will already penalize me for not paying on time. So again, if I'm selling to pay taxes, then there's no law of the right of first refusal because the neighbors cannot evict the person purchasing. More examples. Or when a property was sold to pay for burial expenses or to support of the owner's widow or daughters. Part of it, we're not getting into it right now, but part of the obligations of a ketubah, the person marries a woman, is that if he dies, his wife, the widow, and his daughters are supported from his estate. That's the obligations of marriage, one of the obligations of the ketubah. So here's a scenario where somebody dies and we need cash. Why do we need cash? Quickly, either to pay for the funeral, that's one example, or to support the widow and the widow and the young daughters. In those cases, we don't want to delay the sale, and therefore we say these are cases where the benefit of the seller to get the cash quickly overrides the benefit of the neighbor to have all his fields next to each other, and therefore the law of the neighbor does not apply. Instead, the purchaser acquires the property. So this is a whole range of scenarios. And later, when we get to 11, if we'll get to it today, it gets even more interesting is what happens if there's a dispute. I say I'm selling because I'm desperate to have to pay taxes, and you say you're not. You're just trying to make a loophole and get around the law. Oh, that itself Maimonides rules upon, which itself is a disagreement. So you see the layers of complication here. But so far we're still straight. If there's a legitimate case of one of these cases where the seller, I know, sometimes in somebody, our neighbor, when they bought their house, they sold a house in one town to buy the house they have now. Right? Not everybody can just write a check. Sometimes you got to sell your old house to buy your new house. The problem is, I want to buy a new house. I'm bidding. The problem is, if I have to get my money by selling my first house, I need my first house to sell quickly. And if there is an extra burden, and that is that the extra burden is that now we have to go ask the neighbors what do they think. That's going to slow that. That's going to discourage the buyer, or at least slow the buyer down until he finds out what the neighbors are planning on doing. Then the seller who's trying to sell is going to be harmed because he's not going to be able to buy his dream home because he can't sell the home he's living in. Okay? So therefore we say, there's no law from the right of first refusal. Now, I just want to say that in general, sometimes when lawyers learn the Talmud, they get upset because lawyers I don't know lawyers, the people who think legislators like simplicity. The whole idea of the law is that it's predictable. People can understand and anticipate ideally what the law would say. In reality, it's never that way. But in theoretically, you want a law that will cover as many scenarios as possible to give people clarity. Here is the Talmud takes the other approach. The Talmud wants to weigh every situation and see what is right in this situation. And therefore, even though we say in general, the principle is that we want the neighbor to have all their fields next to each other, and therefore the neighbor has the right, in some certain cases, to get rid of evict the purchaser by reimbursing them, etc. And we'll get more about that in the next chapter, but not always. And every case has to be examined separately. In other words, there's not only every case, there's categories of cases which are exceptions. Look how many exceptions there are to the rule. Why? Because we have to balance the other goods, right? We said it's good to sell to the neighbor, it's moral to sell to the neighbor, but there are other things, there are other moral concerns that sometimes override this one. And this is just some of the examples. So let's read number 10 where he gives the interpretation, and then we'll discuss, and then if we have time, we'll continue. So let's read number 10. Why are the neighbors not given the right to displace the purchaser in all the cases that we discussed in number 9? For in all these situations, the seller is very anxious to sell the property. I don't know what anxious means, if it means anxiety, but it means in the Hebrew, tzorach, there's a big need. The seller has a great need. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Trudin he limkar. Trudin means Trudin is anxious. The seller is very anxious to sell the property, and he is selling it because of a dire need. That's the word I was translating. Yes. So there's a great need to sell in these cases. I have to bury my dead. I have to bury a relative. I have to go to the funeral. I need cash. I have to support the widow. The estate has to support the widow. The estate has to support the daughters, etc. I have to sell my old house so I can put the bid in the new one. If the neighbors were given the right to displace the purchaser, no one would ever be willing to purchase property. But the purchaser would say, why should I trouble myself to purchase this property? So that the neighbor will come and displace me. In other words, eventually, why would I get into it? So I have to go find a buyer and promise them that the neighbor has already agreed, etc. It's just a longer process. And the seller will not be able to wait until the neighbor brings money and purchases it, right? It's not like usually what I can do is I can go to the neighbor and the neighbor says, yeah, I want to buy it. It's not like in America where you could just say, I want to exercise my right of first refusal. Right? It's not just like the neighbor could say, I want to exercise my right of first refusal. As we will see, the neighbor has to show up in court with cash, right? It's very easy to tell if the neighbor is real or bluffing, just wants to get rid of the seller, or he's actually interested in buying it. The bottom line is, this guy doesn't have time to wait for this process to unfold. And therefore, in all these cases, we say we're going to put the good, quote unquote, good for the neighbor aside. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the good for the seller. And sometimes we need to make it a process where it has to be quicker for the seller because that good overrides the good for the neighbor. So that is the first concept that we studied today. We have a few more minutes. So we'll unless there's any questions, we'll proceed and we'll go to the next issue is what happens if there's a dispute where I claim I'm selling because I'm desperate. I'm claim I am selling for the tax. I'm claim I'm selling to buy better land. And the neighbor says, you're not, it's not true. You're just doing it to get you're doing it to block me from evoking the right of the neighbor. So who is the burden of proof upon? That's a very important question, because again, sometimes things can't be proven. And then the question is, what's the status quo? Is the status quo the neighbor wins, or is the status quo that the owner wins? In other words, I could sell it to whoever I want. So that's a very interesting discussion. And it all depends on, it gets to the core of how strong this law is, how strong the law of the neighbor is. Is it enough to affect the status quo, or is the neighbor the one who is trying to change the status quo? And as we will see, that itself is up to debate. Maimonides rules. It's not written explicitly in the Talmud. So that's, again, an interesting scenario where Maimonides doesn't just codify, but he also rules. So that's interesting. Okay. So the journey continues. Number 11. Was it 11? Yeah. 11. The following rules apply when the purchaser claims that the When the purchaser claims that the seller sold the property to him because he was pressed for funds to pay a tax or the like, and the neighbor claims that he is lying and fabricating a story in order to nullify his rights. So here's the scenario. I sell my land to Vicky, I move to Australia. Okay, now the neighbor comes and says, I want the land. So Vicky says, what are you talking about? She says, I bought this land because the seller was in a rush we had to pay the tax, or he had to support whatever the case is. The state had to support the widow, whatever the case is, one of those scenarios where you had to sell a bad land to get a good land. And therefore the neighbor said, and therefore Vicky says that she should keep the land. The neighbor says, what are you talking about? You're fabricating a story. Go prove that the reason why the person sold was to pay the tax. Remember, I'm on a flight to Australia. There's no planes, there's no trains. It may take you 10 years to prove why the sale happened. So it's a very important question to define who, if nobody could prove anything, where does the land go? Does the land go to the purchaser, or does the land go to the seller, to the neighbor? In other words, we know the general rule in the Talmud and in many systems of law is that the burden of proof is the burden of proof is upon, in the language of the Talmud, if you want to extract something from somebody else, the burden of proof is upon me. So if I want to extract from you, I have to prove. The question is, who's extracting from who? Is the neighbor extracting from the purchaser, and therefore the burden of proof is upon the purchaser? Or is the purchaser extracting from the neighbor? In other words, by default, the land belongs to the neighbor. And if the purchaser wants to keep it, he has to prove that it was sold out of the great desperation. So this is a very important question, because determining, again, upon who is the burden of proof in a case of disputes. And that really gets to the question of what is the core, who does it really belong to? And we're just going to see Maimonides, but later I'll contrast Maimonides with the other opinions, and you'll see the reason for the argument. It's very interesting. So let's continue reading. Says Maimonides. Maimonides says the neighbor is responsible for proving his claim. In other words, Maimonides is limiting this law. He's saying if the neighbor cannot prove that this sale was not one of the exceptions, if the neighbor cannot prove that, then the purchaser keeps it. In other words, the status quo is if I sell land to a purchaser, the purchaser keeps it. If the neighbor wants to evoke the right of first refusal, the neighbor has to prove that this sale falls under those definitions. But if the neighbor does not prove anything, then the burden of proof is upon the neighbor, and therefore the land will stay in the hand of the purchaser. The neighbor is responsible for proving his claim. Only then can he expropriate the property from the purchaser. If the neighbor does not prove his claim, the purchaser must support his claim with a shvuat hesed. So there's one little detail here. In general, the law is that there's a burden of proof is upon the person who wants to extract money. So for example, if you come up to me and you say, Menachem, you owe me $100. I say, prove it. If you can't prove it, what's the law? The law is I don't have to pay you. You don't have a document. You don't have evidence. So if you claim I owe you $100 and I deny it, I don't have to pay. That's the law. That's the biblical law. The rabbis say, however, that we want to make the person making the claim, we want him to feel good. We don't want him to feel like the court totally ignored him. So anytime there's a claim that can't be substantiated, and therefore the law is that the defendant does not have to pay, nevertheless, we impose upon the defendant to make what they call a shvuat hesed. Shvuat hesed is make a promise that you're saying the truth. But make no mistake, it's not a real oath because we don't evoke God's name. In the past, when we studied Talmud, we discussed how an oath is a very serious matter, and we say God's name, and people would even pay money not to have to swear. But this is not that oath. It's not a real oath. It doesn't evoke God's name. And therefore, it's a lesser degree of an oath, which we basically use in all scenarios where if you're claiming against me and you can't substantiate your claim, I don't have to pay, but I have to make this shvuat hesed, this lesser form of an oath, to say I'm saying the truth. So don't get so bent out of shape. This is the same formula that happens in every time where the burden of proof is upon the other person and the other person cannot meet their burden of proof. So going back to our scenario, in our scenario, if the neighbor comes, I bought land from a guy who went to Australia. The neighbor comes to me and the neighbor says, what are you doing here? I want to buy it off you. I say, no, the person who bought the land was desperate for whatever reason, one of those cases listed above. The neighbor says, you're lying. I say, I'll tell the neighbor, prove to me that I'm lying. The neighbor can't prove. The purchaser keeps the land, and the purchaser keeps the land. All the purchaser has to do is says, listen, I'm saying the truth, and I'm taking what they call a shvuat hesed, a lesser form of an oath. But again, the lesser form of the oath, that's just the standard law, what happens when the burden of proof is upon somebody else and the other person did not meet the burden of proof. So that is what Maimonides says. It's very interesting to look at the other commentators of Maimonides' colleagues, I guess contemporaries in some way, or a little before, a little after, generally speaking, in the same general period. And others say no. Others say that if we cannot prove whether or not this sale was a sale out of desperation, other people say that the burden of proof is upon the purchaser, and the neighbor would get it by default. But what you see from here, Maimonides disagrees. Maimonides is limiting the scope of the neighbor's right to the neighboring land and putting the burden of proof upon the neighbor. But if the neighbor doesn't prove, then the status quo remains and it goes to the purchaser. Because why does Maimonides say so? So many people believe like this, that biblically speaking, this is a valid sale. I sell my land, it's a valid sale. Biblically speaking, it belongs to the purchaser. The rabbis came and they said this law that you should allow the neighbor to buy it is a rabbinic law. So the rabbinic law is only is responding to a specific scenario. But if the scenario has not been triggered, then the default is the biblical law. The default is that the purchaser gets it. The rabbi said that in certain cases, the neighbor should get it. But if you can't prove that those cases apply, then you go back to the default. What's the default? The default is the biblical law. As opposed to other people say, no. The default is the neighbor gets it. Maimonides says, no, the default is that the neighbor doesn't get it. Why not? Because this whole law is only rabbinic. So before this law is triggered, you go to the biblical scenario, the biblical default, and the biblical default is that the neighbor gets, is that the purchaser gets it. So in other words, you see here that the Maimonides is limiting the scope of this law and saying that it's only a rabbinic law. And again, most people believe it's a rabbinic law, but they're saying unless you can prove that this law applies, the burden of proof is upon the neighbor. If the neighbor can't prove, it goes to the purchaser, because the purchaser has almost like a biblical claim. The biblical claim is, from the Torah's perspective, you pay money, you get land, transaction is completely valid. Above that, there's a rabbinic law that the neighbor should be nice and give it to, and that the purchaser should be nice and give it to the neighbor. Okay, that's a rabbinic law, but it applies in those scenarios where it applies. If we don't know if there's a dispute about if the scenario applies, in other words, if there's a dispute about if the seller sold out of desperation, then we go back to the biblical law, says Maimonides. And therefore, the burden of proof is upon the neighbor because the purchaser is a legitimate purchase because, biblically speaking, it's a legitimate purpose. So that's just a little bit about the back and forth of what's the status quo. Who is coming to change the status quo and what is the status quo?
So is the burden of proof is the biblical law? Where does it say so?
That doesn't have to say. That's considered. It's not articulated in the Torah, but it's considered. It's an axiom. It's a simple concept. But the question is, the burden of proof is, if it's mine, then you want to take it away from me, then the burden of proof is upon you. The question is it mine? Right? That's the question. And then the answer is, it depends. It depends if this law, what's the right of the neighbor to his neighbor's property. You could look at it and say, it's not a right. I don't really have a connection to my neighbor's property. It's just that if my neighbor sells, then the rabbis say, and they tell the purchaser, although it's a legitimate purchase, do be a nice guy, give it to the neighbor. But the neighbor does not really have a claim to the land. That's Maimonides' view. Other people say, no, if I'm your neighbor, I have certain rights to your land, and those rights are triggered if you sell. Of course, if it's just because I'm your neighbor, it doesn't mean I can come in and set up my hammock on your land. But it means that I have sort of an inherent connection to your land. And if you sell, then my right to your land is evoked, is triggered. And then if the neighbor wants to prove that I don't have, that's the status quo. And if the purchaser wants to prove that my right is not triggered, the burden of proof is upon him. That's the other opinion. Maimonides says no. Maimonides says no. The purchaser is the standard. The purchaser is the status quo, because biblically speaking, you give money, you get land. Above that, there's a rabbinic law that says, be a nice guy, give it to somebody else.
So the core disagreement is who actually owns it, who it belongs to, who is extracting from who.
That's right. Okay, in case this was a little complicated, we have one more simple law, and that will be it for today. And again, another scenario where the good that you will do for the purchaser it outweighs the good to do to the neighbor. So what's another case? This is a very interesting case. 13, 14, people will be uncomfortable, the feminists will be uncomfortable, but it would be nice if you see it in the light of the times, you will see that how beautiful it is. But again, let's see. Let's do 13. 13 is certainly easy. When a person sells property to orphans below the age of majority, in other words, they're still young, the neighbor is not given the right to displace the purchaser. For goodness and justice is to act generously towards such individuals more than to a neighbor. I'm selling to strangers, but the strangers happen to be orphans. Says the Talmud, the neighbors can't step in. What are the neighbors going to say? It's very nice. You should do the moral and just thing and sell to your neighbor. Well, it's more moral and just to help the orphan. And therefore, selling to the orphans takes precedence. Okay, that all could agree with. 14 will be a little bit more tricky for the modern world. But again, in that society, this is a beautiful thing as well. Similarly, when a person sells property to a woman, the neighbor is not given the right to displace the purchaser. The rationale is that it is not customary for women to trouble themselves frequently to purchase property. Hence, since the woman did make such an effort and purchase property, it is an act of kindness to allow her to retain ownership on it. In the ancient world, the woman did not get involved in commerce or in marketplace. To go to court, to go and buy land is a big schlep. If you ever tried to buy a house, you see it's a big schlep. So the men are accustomed to it. The women are not. If a woman went through the trouble to buy a house, let her keep it. That's number 14. Now we get to other specific cases. 15 is funny. Not property. If a property was sold to a tumtum or androgynous, which is somebody that halachically and legally we're not sure if they're male or female, a neighbor is given the right to displace them because there is a doubt regarding their halachic status. Possibly they may be considered as a woman. Because it's a doubt, the neighbor takes precedence. And now we get to 15 and 16 gets a little bit more difficult. 16, what happens if two people own part of the land? One person owns the land, the other person owns the trees. So who is considered the owner? Okay, we'll leave that for right now. I want to learn 17 because 17 is a very important law. 17 is very important because it gives, it limits it in a very important way. Okay, what does the law say? The idea was, this gets to the heart and core of this whole discussion. The idea was that if you have a field, you want your other field to be next to your field. Why? Because then you can do the work, you can work both fields together. What happens if there's a natural barrier or any barrier between both fields? So I anyway cannot plow both fields together. Says the Talmud, if you cannot plow both fields together, the law of the neighbor is not triggered. Even though, of course, it's more convenient for you to move your plow 10 feet than to move it 100 miles. It doesn't matter. As long as those fields are not attached to the point that you can actually use the same plow without moving it and plow both fields together, if that is not the scenario, the law doesn't apply. So you see how this is very limiting. So let's read the case, 17. The following rules serve as a guidelines when a row of date palms, a tall and sturdy building, a ditch or the like. So we have different examples. One example is a row of date palms. Dates were very expensive. So if I have a date palm dividing my field, I'm not going to chop down the date palms to make it easier to plow because the date palms are very expensive. So if I have a row of date palms separating my field from my neighbor's field, now I'm the neighbor. Even if I buy my neighbor's field, I can't plow them both together. I have to go around. If you have to go around, you're not really the neighbor. Okay. So if there's date palms, if there's sturdy building, if there's a ditch, right? So I have two fields next to each other, but there's a ditch. If there's a ditch, I can't take the plow down. I can't plow the other field because of the ditch. I have to go all the way around. So in any case, or a wall, right, or property border, we see if it is possible to plant even one row of produce within the intervening entity so that two fields would be joined. If so, he is considered a neighbor and he has the right to displace the purchaser. If not, he may not displace the purchaser. So in a scenario where I have a whole row of date palms, or a whole row or a wall or a ditch, if I can even go one row of produce connecting the fields, it's one field. Then we're neighbors. If I can't plow even one row of produce, we're not neighbors. And I can't say I'm the neighbor, I want both my fields together, because the logic of the law falls. The logic of the law is I want both fields close to each other so I can plow them together. Once you have to go out of the field and go to the next field, once you have to move 10 feet, 100 feet, 1,000 feet, 1,000 miles makes no difference. That's the law. Now, what is so interesting about this? So give me a second. I want to read up to make sure I don't mislead you. But this is actually fascinating.
I think even the previous one is very fascinating for us, because the main goal here is not just the inconvenience, but the purpose of the.
Right.
I mean, the purpose is to work the field, not just, have your own convenience.
Right. But why do I say this law is so fascinating? Because this law triggers a whole nother discussion. There's a debate amongst the early commentators. It's not exactly clear what Maimonides says. There's a debate of what Maimonides says. Some people read this law and say, you know what this law tells me? This law tells me that the law of the right of first refusal does not apply to homes. Why?
Whoa.
Okay, you see, this is big. I knew this is very big. Why? Because let's say I have a home and I want to buy the next door home. Okay. Those homes are not connected unless I do some construction. But without construction, they're not connected. If they're not connected, you're not my neighbor. Just like when it came, right? Because the Talmud says, if you have two fields and there's a ditch in between, and you need to do some construction to connect both fields, the law of the neighbor is not triggered because it's not connected. So some would argue Anytime you have to connect two homes, you have to do some construction, so we're not really neighbors. So that's one category of sages, like Rabbeinu Tam. I'll get into Rabbeinu Tam later. He's a fascinating guy, the grandson of Rashi. He's a fascinating person. I'll talk about Rabbeinu Tam in a minute. Let's put him aside for a second. Others disagree. Others say it works applies to homes as well, because they say construction in the home, that's a common thing. People are not going to chop down date trees to combine two fields, but construction in the home is a common thing. So this is a big dispute. We could sit here all day and discuss it, but you see how something a seemingly innocent law could create a lot of excitement. Who was Rabbeinu Tam? Rabbeinu Tam was the grandson of Rashi. And he was a fascinating figure, and we discussed him many years ago. But you see here he's consistent. Rabbeinu Tam dealt with a changing world, because up till Talmudic times, a little before his times, most of the economy was agriculture. And that has a set of laws and a set of logical laws and a set of internal logic. The problem is, by the time you get to Rabbeinu Tam's times, even a little before Rashi, they moved to Western Europe. The Jewish people are not in agriculture, period. They're in commerce. Now, trying to apply the principles that applied in agriculture to commerce is very, very difficult. Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi's grandson, he was revolutionary in his application of the law to the new times when we move from agriculture to commerce. And he says things that are super radical. For example, just to put one out of the head, and this week's Parsha says that if I borrow money from somebody else, I am not allowed to, if I lend money to somebody else, I'm not allowed to go into their home to collect. Not only I'm not allowed to go into their home, the court cannot go into their home. You have to wait outside, and if the guy says I have no money, you have to trust him. You're not allowed to intrude upon his property. Says Rabbeinu Tam, that law worked, that law made sense when people were in agriculture. So their wealth was outside. So the court won't go into your house to see if you're hiding money from your creditor. But now that there's no more agriculture, your wealth is inside. You could borrow money and hide money under your mattress. You could have money and hide it under your mattress. Now we have to adjust the law. And therefore, Rabbeinu Tam, I'm not going to get into the legalese how he does it, but he changes the law. He says, no, now you could go into the guy's house. Very radical, but he has to respond to the changing times. So I don't know this explicitly, but it's fascinating to see that when it comes to homes, Rabbeinu Tam, what he just did, beneath the radar, what he just did, he says, the entire discussion of law of right of first refusal applies only to fields in Babylonia and Israel, and agriculture doesn't apply to homes in Western Europe. You see what's happening?
That makes sense because of the previous law, because it kind of follows the purpose,
yes.
the purpose of
it's too hard. Yeah, it's a purchase to do good. It's too much of a burden on an economy that is not agriculture to say that every time I sell my house, I'm going to have to go to the neighbors. It slows it down too much. Rabbeinu Tam says it doesn't apply. Others disagree, and the Beis Yosef, for example, the author of the Code of Law, says Maimonides disagrees. But this is a whole nother thing here, whether or not this fundamental question, whether in today's day and age, when we're not, in other words, today, it applies today also in agriculture. The problem is that today 95% of people are not in agriculture. So now the question is whether the concept, the right of first refusal, whether the concept applies within homes or not. And like I said, this is a debate. It would be I have to check up and see what exactly the law is, the law rules. Unfortunately, I don't remember offhand.
But is that a rabbinic law about the separation, the previous one? If there is a row of palm trees.
Yes, the whole law is rabbinic. In other words, the whole obligation, the whole permission to allow the neighbor to get rid of the purchaser is rabbinic. So the rabbis, when they put this law, they put certain restrictions on this law. And the idea is that it has to be both, the logic is to allow you to plow both your fields together. If that criteria...
In that case, not applying to the house is logical.
Right.
Because you're not plowing your front yard.
Right. But on the other hand, it's easier to live in one house than to live in two houses. You have a walk-in closet, and all your weekday clothes are Greenwich Avenue, and your Shabbos clothes is on Mason Street. It's hard to live when you're scattered, right? You'd rather have all your stuff and all your family, everybody together in one house. But the question is, again, the question is, just like the Talmud says, no, you can't start doing construction. These two fields have to be connected before the law can be triggered. The question becomes, two neighboring homes, is that considered construction? Some Rabbeinu Tam says, no, you're not your neighbor's neighbor. Your houses are not connected. Or you're going to build a bridge. Well, that's too late. That you don't have that bridge yet. Others say, no, people make homes, people knock down, people construct homes all the time, as opposed to the case of this Talmud, a palm tree. No one's going to ever chop down a palm tree to plow some grain because the dates are so much more expensive, right? So again, how to apply the Talmud's cases to a changing world is a very serious discussion. And Rabbeinu Tam consistently is very happy to say, sorry, changing economy, the laws don't carry over that neatly.
Yeah, but in this case, it's not about the economy. In this case, about
because think about America. Your wealth is your home, and restriction on how I can sell my home is very important to your livelihood. It would be less so if most of your livelihood was in agriculture, was in fields. Then your home is not your chief investment. It's a big difference. For most of America, your chief investment is your home. So limiting who can sell and how can sell is interfering with the real estate market is a big issue here. That's why in this economy, home prices are so important, because that's where people's wealth is. And therefore, regulating it is a tremendous burden. As opposed to in the ancient world, in agriculture, regulating the home is not such a big deal. Because if you're looking at real estate just as land for agriculture, it really doesn't matter. You can grow the same amount of potatoes in this land, that land, doesn't really matter. Location is much less important. So all I'm trying to say is that this itself is fascinating. How much can carry over to the changing economy? That itself is up for debate.
Rabbi?
Yes.
There was a comment about majority of an orphan. What's considered majority? Is it 13?
Majority, usually it's 13, but with an orphan, it's different. An orphan is until they're self-sufficient. Majority means that they're adult. So what does it mean an adult in the context of orphan? Usually adult is 13, but in this context, if I'm not mistaken, when it comes to orphans, when the Talmud discusses orphans, it means until they're economically self-sufficient. They're old enough to make their own financial. When they're old enough to take care of themselves, that's the bottom line. Mm-hmm. Today you can't take care of yourself until you have a PhD. No, I'm kidding. But the point here is that it was clear. It's not just somebody till he's 13. When a person is 15, they can't support themselves necessarily. So you want to be kind to them. Once a person is 20, just because his father died, it doesn't mean that he has more rights in the marketplace. As opposed to when a person is orphaned in their youth, when they're not self-sufficient. So you want to help them. And the Talmud believes in real estate investment as a good investment. So if you can sell to an orphan, you are really helping them. And again, what that would teach us is that in our case, even if the law doesn't apply, there is a certain value in selling to the orphan against somebody else rather than someone else, all else being equal, right? That's what we can extract from these laws.
And male and female, there was no difference?
So today, I don't think that difference would apply, because today the women are just as involved in real estate. So then it was an exception. It was a burden for a woman to go through the hassle and the difficulty of operating in a male-dominant environment and trying to make a purchase. It was uncomfortable. Now, so we said if a woman does go through the hassle, let her keep it. Right? I don't think that law would apply today, because today it's totally completely normal. It's not considered a greater burden for the woman to make a purchase than for the man.
No, I'm talking about as an orphan. Is it the
same idea? Same is gender neutral.
Talking about gender, you skipped over that one portion where you couldn't tell whether it was a male or a female. Right. Why was that important?
Skip. Yeah, Rabbi Feldman didn't skip, but I thought I didn't have a text in front of you. I have in
15,
front of
maybe?
me. So I had the same question.
You're
How
talking
can
about 15? 15, you mean?
Yeah, androgynous, yes.
Okay, why is this important? The woman in this case has a certain right. The woman is, if I'm a woman, I get to keep my land. Right? That was the idea. If I'm a woman, the neighbor can't evict me. What happens if I don't know if I'm a woman. It's not clear if I'm a woman. Do I have the right of a woman? Here in this scenario, the answer is no. The answer is if you're a woman, you have the right of a woman. If it's in doubt whether you're a woman, you don't have the right of a woman.
I see.
But how is that possible that you don't know?
Oh,
So-
that's possible,
It's possible.
especially today.
Well,
Today
I'm talking about Talmudic times.
Talmudic times, the scenario is that the person is born with both male and female organs. I don't know how common that is, but it's certainly in the Talmud. It's certainly that's what the Talmud means by androgynous, which is a Greek word, if I'm not mistaken. So that's I don't know what the medical, I don't know how common that is, but that's the case.
It's
And
rare.
I'm sorry?
It's rare.
It's rare.
Very rare, but it's possible.
Right. And the Talmud loves cases even if it's not common, the Talmud loves to talk about cases that are not common because those are the borderline cases, right? A woman, what is a woman? If you're in doubt whether someone is a woman, that's a question. Are you a woman or not? Now, I don't care if it's a 1 in a trillion. It's an interesting case, right? What is it that, it's really a question of doubt. Remember, it's a question of doubt. We said, what's the burden of proof? It ties into the burden of proof question. If the woman is an exception to the rule, do I have to approve? If I can't prove that I'm an exception, what happens then? So you go back to the status quo. What's the status quo?
Mhm. Thank you very much. It's an
Thank you.
interesting discussion.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun. We will be back tomorrow to finish the talk of the Rebbe, but I think I'm going to be away Thursday and Friday. So I'll send that an email either way, but it's always fun to study. So thank you for joining.
And
Thank
Rabbi,
you so much, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you.
bye-bye now.
Be
Bye.
well.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I was wondering if this is not associated at all. If I could give you my grandson's name, he's going off to